Oil just crossed $100 a barrel for the first time since May, and it didn't happen because of some abstract economic shift. It happened because tankers were struck off the coast of Saudi Arabia, because a critical waterway thousands of miles from American shores just got threatened with a blockade. And because the President of the United States told reporters this week that he is close to deciding whether to launch what he personally called, in his own words, a massive attack. 13 consecutive nights. That's how long American bombers have now been hitting Iranian territory without pause, and instead of winding down, every single signal coming out of Washington right now points toward this getting bigger, not smaller. If you've been watching this war unfold since February, you already know it doesn't move in a straight line. It spikes, it pauses, it spikes again, harder each time. But what's happening this week is different from the pattern we've seen before, because for the first time, we're not just talking about airstrikes anymore. We're talking about a full military buildup, a genuine reinforcement of troops, aircraft, and firepower into the region, on a scale that officials themselves are describing as preparation for the most intense strikes of the entire conflict. Let's start with what's actually confirmed, because this story doesn't need exaggeration to be alarming. As of Friday, U.S. Central Command confirmed its 13th consecutive night of airstrikes against Iranian targets, where Iranian state media reported American missiles hit locations around the capital of Khuzestan province, one of Iran's most oil-rich regions. Iran responded almost immediately, launching retaliatory drone and missile strikes against American military targets in Bahrain, Kuwait, and Jordan, all in a single morning. This isn't a war confined to one country anymore. It's a war being fought simultaneously across half a dozen nations, and every one of those nations is now bracing for the next round. At sea, the picture is just as tense. The U.S. military confirmed it disabled a tanker attempting to bypass its blockade on Iranian ports, a blockade that's now being enforced with direct action, not just warnings. And it's not only the Strait of Hormuz anymore. Iran-backed Houthi rebels in Yemen have escalated their own campaign, striking a Saudi vessel in the Red Sea and threatening to blockade the Bab al-Mandeb Strait, a critical bypass route that ships have been using specifically to avoid the danger in Hormuz. Saudi Arabia responded with its own strikes against Houthi positions in Yemen. In other words, the alternate route everyone was counting on to keep oil moving is now becoming just as dangerous as the one it was supposed to replace. That's precisely why oil prices didn't just tick up this week. They surged past a symbolic and deeply consequential threshold that hasn't been crossed since May. Now here's where the story turns toward exactly what that headline promises. Because Trump didn't just continue the bombing campaign this week, he escalated the rhetoric around it in a way that should get everyone's attention. Speaking to reporters, he said he was close to deciding whether to launch what he described directly as a massive attack, laying out what he called his exit strategy for the war in blunt terms. There's a military exit, he said, where you just keep going the way things are, and you can even make it a heavier dose, and it's knocking out everything. Or there's a smarter strategy, he said, where you make a deal, and Iran wants to make a deal. He added that he doesn't think they're ready yet, but that they do want one. That's about as clear as it gets. The President of the United States is telling the public, on the record, that the alternative to a negotiated deal isn't a continuation of the status quo. It's an intensified, heavier version of the war already underway, one deliberately designed to knock out everything. This is precisely why troop and equipment movements into the region have accelerated so dramatically over the past several days. Additional fighter jet squadrons, special operations units, aerial refueling aircraft, and long-range bombers have been surging into the theater, and B-1 bombers based out of the UK have already been used in active strike missions against Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps targets, a claim independently reported by Axios and separately alleged by Iranian state media through the Tasnim news agency. Iran responded to this directly and ominously by warning that any base used to launch strikes against Iranian territory, including RAF Fairford in England, would now be considered a legitimate target. The United Kingdom's government responded within hours, stating publicly that its armed forces are ready 24/7 to defend the country from any kind of attack, whether on British soil or from abroad. Read that carefully. A NATO ally is now openly acknowledging it may need to defend its own homeland because of its role supporting American strikes on Iran. That is how far this conflict has already spread beyond its original borders, and it's a direct preview of what wider escalation could actually mean for the world beyond just the Middle East. Meanwhile, back home, the political fight over this war has reached a boiling point of its own. The House of Representatives voted for a second time this week, 214 to 208, to direct President Trump to either end the war in Iran or formally seek congressional authorization to continue it. Just hours later, Senate Republicans blocked a similar measure from even coming up for consideration, marking the 12th time the Senate has voted on an Iran war powers measure since the start of the year. 12 votes. That number alone tells you how contested, how unresolved, and how politically fraught this war has become domestically, even as it continues escalating abroad completely independent of what Congress wants. In the middle of all that, the House also passed a $1.15 trillion defense bill that specifically sets up billions of additional dollars to be unlocked for the Iran war. A clear signal that regardless of the political disagreement over authorization, the financial and logistical machinery to keep fighting and to keep expanding is already being built into place. And there's one more thread here that deserves real attention because it reframes the entire regional picture. This week, the United States signed a new agreement with Saudi Arabia, one that could allow the kingdom to enrich its own nuclear fuel, a move that multiple outlets have described as reversing decades of long-standing American non-proliferation policy. Whatever the intent behind that deal, the timing is impossible to ignore. In the middle of a war explicitly justified by concerns over Iran's nuclear ambitions, the United States has just opened the door to a rival Gulf power pursuing its own nuclear fuel enrichment. Analysts are already raising direct questions about what this means for long-term stability in the region, regardless of how this current war concludes. On the diplomatic side, the picture is just as bleak. Iranian and Iraqi officials confirmed this week that Iran formally rejected a ceasefire proposal brought forward by President Trump and delivered through Iraqi Prime Minister Ali al-Zaidi. Iran's top negotiator, Brigadier General Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, told reporters there was no need for another mediator, effectively closing the door on that particular attempt at de-escalation. Iran's own rhetoric has hardened alongside its rejection of that offer, with reports describing Tehran as uninterested in anything resembling a temporary deal. Secretary of State Marco Rubio put it more bluntly earlier this week, saying Iran is, in his words, begging for a deal with the United States, but simply isn't ready to make one yet. Even the United Nations has stepped in with language far more urgent than its usual diplomatic caution. Secretary General Antonio Guterres warned directly that the situation in the Middle East is, quote, getting out of control, and told world leaders in a message posted publicly that it's time to step back, that the fighting must stop everywhere, and that freedom of navigation must be restored. When the head of the United Nations starts using language that direct, that unambiguous, it's a strong signal of just how close to a genuinely uncontrollable situation this conflict is believed to be. So take a step back and look at everything converging at once, right now, this week, not months from now. 13 consecutive nights of American strikes with no indication of stopping. A president openly weighing a massive escalation as his primary alternative to a deal Iran has already rejected. Oil surging past $100 a barrel as two of the region's most critical waterways edge toward simultaneous blockade. A NATO ally publicly preparing its own homeland defenses because of its role hosting American bombers. A deeply divided Congress locked in an escalating political battle over war powers, even as new funding keeps flowing toward the fight. And a fresh nuclear agreement with Saudi Arabia landing in the middle of a war that was supposed to be about preventing exactly that kind of proliferation in the first place. None of these threads exist in isolation. Together, they form the clearest picture yet of a war standing at a genuine inflection point, one where the president himself has said the decision on whether to unleash a massive attack could come soon. Whether that decision lands in the coming days as an intensified bombing campaign, a wider ground operation, or against the current trend an actual diplomatic breakthrough, remains genuinely uncertain. But the machinery for the harder path, the heavier dose, the strikes designed to knock out everything is already moving into place. Watch the next 72 hours closely. Because if the pattern of this war holds the way it has every single time before, escalation, not de-escalation, is exactly where this is headed next.